Maurice Blackburn had put the free will of the working man ahead of his own political gain. He had fought for the rights of people of German descent during a period of extreme racism. He and Doris had a son, Maurice Jr., who was now 2 years old, and there was another baby on the way. And in these post-war years, the cost of living had skyrocketed in the early months following the end of the war. Maurice and Doris weren't immune from that. So as the 1917 Victorian state election approached, the stakes were high, personally and professionally, especially as a new issue had emerged.
He was very against the idea of the war being used as a pretext to crack down on people, to crack down on minorities like German Australians, people from German background. So when there was a crackdown on Lutheran churches and the idea of abolishing all Lutheran churches, Maurice stood up for them. He spoke out against it. And this cost him dearly. People made all sorts of allegations, unfounded allegations about Maurice accepting German gold and whatever.
Maurice was punished at the polling booth for his views. His political career was over, and more practically, he was out of a job. He was also exhausted. The bitter political campaign had taken its toll on his physical health. Doris was worried. With his spirits and energy at the lowest point in his adult life, he returned to his legal career and started to rebuild his practice as a barrister.
Who's going to employ him? Who's going to employ him, really? The loyalist, the wealthy loyalist Australians, the firms and the solicitors are going to look rather askance, despite his brilliance as an advocate, at employing Maurice, one suspects.
Incoming briefs were few and far between. It was a dark and worrying time. And in 1919, Maurice removed his name from the role of counsel. He was finished as a barrister. To his opponents, cheering his misfortune, it was a spectacular fall from grace. But Maurice was pivoting to his natural constituency. He would work to balance the scales of justice for working men and women. In 1919, Maurice opened the doors to his legal practice, Maurice Blackburn Co. Victoria's industrial and labour law framework was evolving fast, and Maurice dedicated himself to serving the interests of trade unions and their members.
As soon as Maurice had set up his business as a solicitor, he notified the Trades Hall Council that he was now open for business, and the Trades Hall Council then immediately went and pinned a notice on the notice board.
And his natural inclination, anyway, is to be an advocate for the labour movement. That's where his life is. And so he establishes a firm whose speciality is standing up both for trade unions but also for working people. That he will defend working people pro bono. He will defend and advocate for trade unions with the Arbitration Commission and in the courts. And this becomes the raison d'etre of the Maurice Blackburn legal firm.
With Maurice a proven voice for the labour movement, word of his new practice travelled fast. The workers of Melbourne could now be defended by a man they saw as one of their own. Maurice hires a young man recently returned from the war as managing law clerk, Bill Slater, a name that would later rival Maurice's in industrial law. They set about tackling the nation's complex web of state-based industrial arbitration regimes, which often enabled employers to exploit gaps in legislation and avoid paying award wages or adhere to minimum standards.
It would have been difficult for Maurice Blackburn, working in a small legal firm for a handful of unions, trying to assist them achieve their industrial campaigns and protect workers' rights. It's difficult now. And the work he did in that area was pace-setting, and it's always harder to be groundbreaking than it is to follow on.
Maurice was in his element, combining his legal expertise with fighting for the rights and freedoms of the worker.
Maurice Blackburn's legal practice was built around the idea of levelling the playing field, of intervening in whatever way the law could to make the outcome fairer, more reasonable.
But Maurice would do more than provide legal representation to workers.
So Maurice is, really important in helping to establish the Victorian Labour College. And this was just for ordinary workers to come together and to be educated.
Maurice believed education was the key driver to reforms and freedom for working people. If workers understood the rights and the workings of the institutions that held them back, they could activate change. He displayed an easy-to-understand intellect when he spoke and made a lasting impression on the minds of his growing audiences. Maurice inspired enthusiasm and hope in speeches and essays that promoted equality and justice for all.
He wanted change agents, and this was about creating change agents. Teaching people about their rights, teaching people about how to stand up for their rights.
His work in labour law expanding and his grassroots advocacy for workers gaining traction, Maurice's star was rising once again within the Labour Party. In 1919, he was appointed Victorian President of the Labour Party. It is a stunning comeback, and its timing couldn't be more important. As the cost of living became increasingly untenable, and workers became emboldened by the communist revolutionaries and militant trade unionists, strike action swept across Australia. Maurice had built strong alliances and friendships with trade union power brokers and played a central role in some of the most protracted and important industrial disputes. One of the most hostile and bitter of these disputes was the National Seamen's Strike of 1919.
The consequences of that in Victoria were very severe, since Victoria was entirely dependent for power, lighting and heating on coal transported from New South Wales. So by the time the strike has reached May 1919, Melbourne is cold and shivering and dark.
Maurice negotiated a compromise that finally ended the strike in August of that year. Following the victory, Maurice becomes the go-to advisor for unions and their members. The Amalgamated Society of Engineers, wanting to apply for a landmark federal award, seek out Maurice. With the case due to be heard in the High Court of Australia, Maurice briefed an up-and-coming barrister in the case, Robert Menzies. Menzies makes his name winning the case and would later go on to become Australia's longest-serving Prime Minister. It was not lost among the legal fraternity that Menzies owed his early success to Maurice Blackburn. The Depression years of the 1920s and early 1930s were particularly tough on Maurice's growing and mostly working-class list of clients. His genuine devotion to those in need and unyielding belief in equal access to justice saw his practice evolve into a clearly plaintiff-focused legal firm.
Well, the plaintiff law firm is designed to find remedies, practical remedies, and often that meant, these are the truths of the matter, that if the plaintiff couldn't afford to pay the fees, and the lawyers would write off their fees if the case was fought and not successful. And this was just a practical way of giving legal aid to people who otherwise might have a perfectly good case, but they couldn't bring it to justice because they just didn't have the money in the kitty to pay their lawyer up front.
The profile that came from being a warrior for the workers armed Maurice for his second run at Parliament. The campaign would pit him against some of the most controversial characters of Labor politics in one of the grubbiest election campaigns in modern history. The fight to represent the Labor Party heartland, Fitzroy, in 1925.